welcome to Chapter 9 for Core Training Concepts. This chapter is going to revolve around really expanding what the whole meaning of core is. Now, I understand that there's going to be the training components of everything here, but I think that just opening up your eyes to a little bit more about how the core really doesn't relate to solely the abs or the lower back. It's a conglomerate of many different areas, and I hope that by the end of this time we can take those areas and put into play exercises that will work accordingly with the concepts we're going to go over. So um, it's more about really getting you to understand you know how the core functions, what the musculature is that it's made up of, what segments of core musculature we're really talking about here, and all of those concepts that go with it, because that's going to be a majority of what you're going to be tested upon. Now, on the test itself, or if you're in class on your test that you're going to take this week, what you're going to realize is that there's going to be questions on there that are going to relate to the exercise and what location you're talking about. Okay, so that you're going to have to be able to understand the exercises that go along with it as well. All right, so let's break down into the concepts here, and we'll go from here. So really, one of the things that I want you to pay attention to is that NASM really, um, they really go by what's called core. They refer to everything as the lumbopelvic hip complex, or the LPHC. So when you're going through and looking at your study materials, you'll see that term, the acronym a lot, and that's really what we're referring to: lumbar spine, the pelvis or the pelvic girdle itself. All right, the hip complex, meaning the hip joint, which includes both the hip itself and the femur that is attached, well, not attached directly, but is associated with the hip complex. And then, of course, we have our centralized region, which doesn't really fit into the whole naming, but it's still there, and that's the abdominal region. Okay, and it's a lot of different components that we don't really think of. So when you talk about the core musculature, there's three different sections really, or divisions of the core, or the stabilization or movement system. So when we look here, the local stabilization system, we're talking about more internal areas. The global system is going to be more external. That's going to still help with stabilizing the lumbopelvic hip complex and maintaining adequate posture, so that then you can use the movement system correctly and as needed. Okay, so that's what we're talking about. Local stabilization system is really internal structures that's going to help to stabilize the LPHC. Global is larger musculature that's going to be more specialized to the regions that it's going, that it's going to be more specific to the overall large body surface area that we're talking about, to make sure that those local stabilizers are enhanced, and vice versa. And then lastly, the movement system, which is really about how all of those specific muscles, the lats, the hip flexors, the hamstrings, and the quads, how they basically attach to the hip, the pelvis, and the spine, to help it to move, or move limbs in particular. Okay, we're talking obviously about arms and legs. So each one of them, and has their own definitive areas. So we're talking here about the transversus abdominis, the internal obliques, the lumbar multifidus, the pelvic floor musculature, which is very difficult to see from most diagrams, and then the diaphragm, which is really kind of interesting. So the diaphragm is very, very stabilization heavy, and that's really because of the fact that if you set the diaphragm correctly in any exercise that you're doing, you're basically allowing for a locked in position to occur of these local and, of course, the global stabilizers, to help maintain spine rigidity, meaning keeping a neutral spine, or the spine in place to where it's got to be. So that's one of the ways that we can help with that. That's just one example that we can use. All right. The global stabilizers, we're talking about the quadratus lumborum, or the QL as sometimes referred to. Again, more external muscles, the psoas group. Typically, the psoas can become a very overactive muscle and can become very, very tight. All right. The external obliques versus the internal. so more rotational from there. There are portions of the internal obliques that can be used. The rectus abdominis, which I'm sure you know about, and then the adductors, which again, the adductors are in the upper leg, but the cool thing about that is that they connect directly to the hip. So we're still talking about hip stabilization, hip, and then eventually be able to help stabilize in terms of moving. That's why a lot of times when you go back to squatting and things like that, your adductors truly are sore because they're stabilizing your body as you squat down and squat back up. So they're, that's their job. It's their synergistic effect, if you remember that term that we talked about in earlier chapters. And then lastly, your gross musculature, your big musculature that everybody kind of knows more about than anything else, and that's your wings or your lats, the hip flexors, your hamstrings, and your quadriceps, and those are all very important for limb movement. All right, of the core. This is core musculature. Obviously, we have way more musculature that we can talk about, but we're talking about core. So these are core. Now you're like, well, the lats. That makes no sense. The lats are a back muscle. Well, they are, but if you think about where the um, the attachment site is, with the lat, most people realize that it's a back muscle. Well, yeah, but it attaches to the humerus, but it also directly makes contact and connects directly to the spinal, the vertebrae of the spine. So you're talking about spinal stabilization or lumbar and a little bit of thoracic stabilization because like I said, it connects directly to there. So when you contract that muscle, you're actually going to be working. The spine's going to be able to be in proper position as well. So the stabilization system, very, very important. It's very much necessary to have it strengthened. It also needs to be, there needs to be flexibility and flexibility and strengthening that occurs in different areas there. And the reason why we have to have proper strength in specific areas and proper flexibility in specific areas is because typically that's where injury and then obviously low back pain comes from. So we have to be able to focus on these areas to make them, of quality. Okay, so you can be strong all you want, like it says here in the movement system, but this is where when you have this breakdown of the stabilizing muscles, it doesn't matter how strong those movement system muscles are because you're eventually it's going to deteriorate the movement patterns that you have because you're going to become hurt or you just or not debilitating, but you're just going to become hurt. Okay, so what do we need to do? We definitely need to get our people to think about strengthening the stabilizers first before we get going into the movement system. Okay, that's very, very important, and I think sometimes that is overlooked by a lot of trainers and even a lot of experienced trainers. But again, with experience, you're hoping that something like this won't be a problem because those people understand that, okay, well, we can do it this way, and by doing it this way, you're only going to enhance the smaller muscle groups that really require more attention first, because the larger movement system muscles can become enhanced rather quickly, whereas it may take some time to be able to eventually enhance those stabilizers. So it doesn't matter who you are. You need to always it doesn't matter if you're an athlete, if you're just a regular person who is a carpenter or a garbage truck worker or whatever it may be. Like, those stabilizers are going to be critical for day-to-day operation, maintaining health, diminishing injury, diminishing asymmetry or side-to-side differences. So there's a lot of things that come from that. All right. So don't take the stabilization system for granted just because you have strong mover muscles or movement system muscles. All right. So what ends up happening, and they call it the scientific rationale, is like it says here, it's decreased activation of the stabilizing mechanism in individuals with chronic lower back pain. So what's happening here is you're actually turning off or deactivating these stabilizers and the way that they function, especially when it becomes a low back concern. Well, we have to understand here that it's very dependent upon the person. Okay, now one person may end up having tight calves, which cause tight hamstrings, which really pull on the lower back musculature or the lumbar region, rather intensely. Well, that's how that person works. Another person might have really good quad hamstring strength. They might have decent anterior or frontal stabilization, because maybe they are a person who thinks that doing crunches and planks and everything like that is great, but you're not enhancing low back musculature. Well, that's going to cause more anterior strength, and that's going to put lower back into a really compromised position. So if you're very heavy anteriorly, you can end up causing the hips to change their direction, which then in turn will cause a change in the spine, which will then, like it says, decreased activation. It'll start deactivating those muscles that need to be turned on for proper balance between front and back. Okay. So, we need to understand that we need to, so they're down here when they're saying performing specific exercises, we need to make sure that we optimize different areas correctly so that we don't either cause a flare up of a person who may not have, that already has low back pain. You want to minimize or diminish that low back pain, or you want to just, or it's preventative purposes, or just making sure we're doing all of the things that will help offset any chance of low back pain occurring. Well, I mean, I think it's something like 80. It's more than 80% of people experience low back pain at least once in their life, and that's acute. That's not chronic. That's just acute, meaning like at some point, 8 out of 10 people will have an experience of low back pain of some sort, and whether it be short term, and or long term. So that says a lot about how our lumbar region or our low back region really can be affected. So just kind of keep that in mind when you're talking about making sure we're performing the correct exercises for the correct people. We also need to make sure the term contraindications, things that we shouldn't be doing with people because of a specific condition that they may have. So always keep these things in the back of your mind, because if there is low back pain, doing things like barbell back squats where you have compression force on the spine is only going to make it worse. Um, Doing things like hyperextensions where you're in the 45-degree apparatus with your feet locked in, and you bend at the waist, and you basically flex the spine, then extend the spine. I mean, that may cause a flare up in somebody because those muscles are not they're not acting correctly anyway because they're deactivated. Well, what's going to end up happening is you're going to pull on regions that really shouldn't be pulled upon. So we got to make the right selection and make sure we activate everything correctly so that we can get ourselves into optimal position and optimal strength and mobility. All right. So how do we work with stabilization? Um, we basically can do everything from, like it says there, the drawing in maneuver, where you're trying to pull the belly button in toward the spine. It's a navel, belly button, same thing, and that's going to draw. And um, they call it I believe it's the cat camel is a really good example of that, where you're on all fours, you're quadruped at that point, and you're on your hands and your knees, and what you're doing is you're just doing in breathing. It's a breathing mechanism where you're trying to just bring that belly button in as far back into the spine as you possibly can, and that's going to draw in those local stabilizers to really help them. Very, very good exercise for that. And then bracing is a little bit different than drawing in, where drawing in is more about the breathing aspect. So you're not really, you're using the local stabilizers, but with bracing, you're basically causing the spine to become stable. And I don't like to, I like the word locked, but locked can sometimes mean something negative. But really, what we're doing is we're using the global muscles of the rectus abdominis, the external obliques, and the quadratus lumborum through the use of the diaphragm to brace that central region of that lumbar spine so that your spine stays. And again, don't like to use this word because sometimes, again, it's more of a negative, but having your spine being rigid. So that's one of the things that, we definitely have there. So it's just rigidity is good, except you don't want to have it rigid when things need to be absorbed. That's what we're referring to here. So just remember that, is that we always want to have proper bracing when we're doing specific exercises. All right. So, what are we trying to do here? Like it says here, we want to maintain, for stabilization, maintain the cervical spine. Okay, keep that neutral position of the spine. And like a lot of times you'll see a perfect example is someone doing a sit up. And what do? They start getting their hands behind their head, and nothing, if you can handle putting your hands behind your head, but typically people who start getting fatigued, they'll start pulling on the head. Therefore, cervical spine, upper spine, neck region is going to be compromised because now you're pulling on the back of the head, which is causing tension in that cervical region. Okay. So by doing that, by keeping yourself in that neutral position, like it says here, during core training, you're going to have better posture, you're going to have better balance of all musculature of that region, and the stabilization that can occur at that time. So it's starting at the neck, which is really crazy. Um, that's amazing. Is that just by having the neck in optimal alignment is really critical. I don't. Some of you who might be a little bit older, you might remember like your coaches when you were like squatting in high school or something like that. And if they're doing it now, then it's so scary. But your coaches used to say, okay, when you squat, make sure you look up and legit move your neck to look up at this toward the ceiling and find a place on now what we talk about is neutral cervical spine, and then your eyes will fixate on something out in front of you versus what it used to be, which is put your neck up. In a deadlift, when you're coming off the ground, even for a heavy or a not so heavy deadlift, our neck is always staying neutral and it's going with the motion of our body. So that's how we can help with making sure that we have this optimal posture, and then that creates a better tension within the muscles that are being called upon, which is what we want to pull correctly. Okay. So, what is it that we're saying here with core training is that we want to have proper stabilization so that we can help our movement system work effectively. Now, interestingly enough, you might think that your core region or your abdominal region in particular is very very explosive. Well, that's not necessarily the case. Type 1 musculature is pretty rampant throughout the core stabilization system. Um, why? Because it can handle long duration loading or contraction. I shouldn't say loading, long duration contraction. So think about how long you can hold a plank for, especially if you start becoming more and more conditioned. Okay. Um, and that's providing, either static or dynamic stabilization for that LPHC. So really you need to think about, how long of time under tension can you hold? Can you hold a plank longer than a minute? Can you hold a plank for 2 minutes? Well, if you're holding it for 2 minutes, that's definitely um, more of a type 1 style fiber than it is a type 2 because it would have fatigued out at that point. And because you can constantly hold your posture in a certain position, definitely shows as type 1. So what are the things that we have to understand when it comes to designing, what we call an integrated program, a systematic, meaning proper progression, integrated, meaning you're taking a lot of things and putting them together. How do we design an integrated program? Well, we want to move and properly progress the right way. Progression and being systematic or properly programmed. Okay, that's how we're going to make a good integrated program for us. Now, you can have a full day of core training if you really wanted to. And I mean, abdominal region, lower back training, things like that. But um, it's one of those things where, you just, you can implement core training concepts into any of your exercise programs. And NASM does it a little bit differently, where they actually front load core training before all of your heavy lifting. So, but before we get into the programming part of everything, let's talk about why and how we're going to do this the right way. So with progression, we're talking, or it says progressive, but having a proper progression, yeah, you're going to always work from easy to hard. It's working from decondition to condition, easy to hard. You're going to go with simple motions that or that a person may know, and then eventually work on more complex things that maybe they know or don't know, but it's going to be harder for them, more challenging. And there's your known to unknown. Do the things that they know how to do first. There's nothing wrong with that. And then as they become more, I want to say successful, but also as they become more knowledgeable for their own selves, then start giving them things because they understand body awareness a little bit better. All right. The proprioception is definitely, more adequate than what it was. And then eventually you can work from stable to unstable. Now, I'm just letting you all know that I, as a professional, and just from my opinion, and it's my opinion only, and everybody can take this with a grain of salt, but I'm not a huge advocate of unstable, but that does not mean that you cannot use it. That's just, I'm just giving you an opinion of, like as a professional, I choose not to work with the unstable. Unless it's for rehabilitation, that's really the only time that I really work with an unstable base of support. So, but again, you're more than welcome to do the things that you do. You might be doing different research and see different things that, maybe I don't. So there's nothing wrong with that. And having a difference of opinion is what makes us a different professional than the next. So, but like I said, this is my way of kind of, talking about it. So, and then being systematic, what we're going to do is we're going to talk about how things are going to work from those OPT model phases. So systematic meaning you're going to progress in the proper format. So stabilization, strength, and power. So stabilization is going to rely more on that body weight to lighter weight, longer duration holds or more reps. Whereas with strength, you're talking more about the added weight and more, maybe a little bit more compressive force or more pulling force or whatever it may be, and lower time under tension or less reps of time under tension. And then power, you're talking about using that core musculature to explode and be able to do certain things like rotation or side to side movements or front to back movements, using all three planes to be able to explode and have more have a high strength output in a very short period of time. All right. So again, we talked about planes of motion being there in all three. Now with core, you definitely want that because you want your spine, you want the lumbar region to really, feel the different loadings that are placed on the axial and the appendicular. Well, more axial skeleton, more centralized region skeleton. Whereas frontal, you're talking more side to side, and then transverse is definitely rotation. Well, it's going to challenge musculature in different planes and in different motion settings. So it's going to make it that you can be a little bit more well-rounded. So again, start with sagittal, move to sagittal and frontal, then use sagittal, frontal, and transverse all in that. So don't just stick to one, or you don't have to go sagittal only, frontal only, transverse. No, as you start progressing, you're going to start to then change those variables for those planes of motion. In terms of types of resistance, you can see them all there. I don't, power balls. That power balls are more of medicine balls. I don't know why they call them power balls. Kind of interesting to me. Tubing is bands. Okay, so those are just kind of a couple of things there, but you can see it's very simple to what we already know about in terms of like exercise equipment. Okay, so with core training, I said there's going to be those three levels: stabilization, strength, and power. We kind of hit on what each one of them did, but here's where we're going to go into this, stabilization, core stabilization exercises. So like it says here, it involves little joint motion. So this is more, this might be a little bit more isometric holding. You all know it's a plank, all right? But what is the whole purpose of this? It's like it says here, deep stabilization. It's about taking and trying to enhance both the local and global stabilizers to make them stable, so that when it comes to movement, those areas stay stable while the movement system takes over and does its job in terms of propelling limbs. Okay. Core strength base. Now you're going to talk about actually doing more isotonic or eccentric concentric movement through full ranges of motion. If you see here, we're just talking about cable rotations or oblique twists, whatever you want to call them. Everybody has a different name for these, but really they're cable rotations. I believe that's what NASM calls this exercise. But again, you're going to go through rotation. So this is transverse plane, okay? And you can tax this system too in a stabilizing manner, just by instead of rotating, you can just take your arm, put it straight out in front of you, keep the hips and the shoulders square, and hold it out in front of you, and that's going to still tax the rotational movement, the rotational musculature that you're working with here. Okay, but definitely a strengthening exercise because and the reason why they say it's strengthening is because you're actually going to go through full range of motion. Okay, that's what differentiates it there. And then power, again, trying to increase rate of force development. What this actually is the image isn't really the greatest, but this gentleman had the ball up overhead, and what he's doing is he's doing like almost like a soccer throw in, except instead of going up into the air, he's working on slamming that down to the ground. So, I mean, if you have a really good wall in front of you, you'd want to slam it. You want to have that overhead, and then you want to go into shoulder extension, slam the ball toward the ground, make it hit the ground, bounce off the wall, come back to you. You can do it with 2 feet together. You can do it with a step, offset legs, whatever it may be. But again, it's about power, about exploding, about increasing, as they say, rate of force production. So your force production is gonna increase. Therefore, it's gonna put a little bit more, um, uh, I don't want to say pressure, but it's gonna put a little bit more emphasis on the movements that you're gonna be doing. Okay. Now, depending upon what you're looking for, if you're in phase 1, when we start getting into the OPT model, phase 1, and then strength levels are phase 2, 3, and 4, and then power is phase 5. And what we're saying there with those is that they each have a different set of mechanisms to be used. So if you look, your stabilization is truly, look at 1 to 4 exercises, 1 to 4 sets, high reps, but the tempo is low. Okay, and you have a shorter rest, and you have a pretty short rest period. Now, if you're going 20 reps, you might need 90 seconds, especially depending upon your level of conditioning, but you get the idea. But you're going to be going slow and controlled. Or like you saw before in this image here, you might be taking, instead of it being, because again, this is a plank, instead of it being reps, it might be time under tension. So it could be, it says 12 to 20 reps, but it could be 30 to 60 seconds. All right, and then rest accordingly. With strength, well, it depends on, is it muscle, is it more muscularly endurance based? That's going to be a little bit higher reps, but not as great. Is it going to be more hypertrophy based, meaning you're trying to help those muscles grow a little bit? Now it's challenging, but it can be done. And then or is it true strength based, where it's phase 4? So just depending upon where you are is going to depend upon where your reps are. Whether it's going to be higher or lower depending upon if you're adding weight. Now it says 0 to 4, and then power is 0 to 2 in terms of number of exercises. So in some sense, if you're doing stabilization stuff, you may not have to do either one of these. If you're doing maybe 2 up here, maybe do 1 and 1, or 2, 2, and 2, who knows? So it's up to you, all right? But again, a lot of times this comes up front in terms of what you're going to be doing before your true resistance training stuff. So unless you're dedicating a whole day to this, then you can kind of program everything a little bit differently. So it just depends on what your goals are. But again, it's optional, all right, at that point. But again, 2 to 3 sets, 8 to 12 reps. Now with the strength base, the tempo is pretty medium, so it's not super explosive. But again, power is as fast as possible, but it's under it's still controlled, and your body is not just flailing just because you want to get the movement done. Okay, so it just depends on what you're looking for. So again, programming, you can do, like I said, you can do a full exercise day of that. It's up to you, but ultimately it can be put in before you do some of your resistance training. In terms of a NASM model, some people like to do it after resistance training, which is not unheard of. So it just depends on what it is that you're looking to do. Okay, and it's what you're, and really it's going to come down to what your clients, or your athletes, or whoever you're going to be training, are looking forward to doing, and then what they may have done in the past that might make learning a little bit easier. So just take all of those things into consideration. All right, but again, this is really a nice synopsis of Chapter 9's core. There's some more, and so one of the good things about the book is that if you look at certain parts of the book, there are exercises that they give you a bunch of different exercises that you can do. So if you are in Chapter 9, So I'm looking at the book right now. Starting on page 235, it gives you, one, two, three. It gives you four decent core stabilization exercises, core strengthening. They go into one, two, three, four. Yeah, they have about four exercises per that you can work with, and then typically, just I want to make sure because I don't want to give you the wrong information. Um, Also, just so you can understand, if you go into the back of the book as well, on pages on the 600s here, when you go into the 600s, there's actually the section of the muscular system, and you can go in and look up a lot of the actual muscles that we talked about, like the psoas group, internal and external obliques, transversus and rectus abdominis, the QL, which quadratus lumborum, the diaphragm is there, the multifidus is there, the lats. So anything after page 6, what did I say it was? After page, well, if we're going to go with just those, it would be um, really page 631 and beyond is going to give you all those terms. So the local and global stabilization plus the movement system, and they're all there. So just take a look at them, get a feel for them because I think that'll help you understand the movement and the direction. So don't skip out on that as well. And then I know that NASM has other resources in terms of other areas for like certain exercises that you can do. If you go into the back as well, um, here we go. Yeah, if you go onto page 577, it gives you some more exercises that you can work with in terms of core um, that maybe you didn't get from the chapter itself. So look at those, use that as a resource, and then I think that'll help you to understand like how they want you to look at it from a core training concept design and what maybe they think is good for stabilization, strength, and power. All right. Other than that, I appreciate taking a listen, and I hope everybody has a great day. Talk to you soon.